In December of 1990, a very concerned father was pacing around his kitchen, hoping that his daughter would call. But the phone stayed silent. And as it did, an anxious pit formed in his stomach. He was really worried about his daughter. He thought maybe she was in trouble. And also, he was worried that he himself might have accidentally just done something that could make things even worse. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please hack the Like Button's Facebook account and delete their date of birth so that nobody wishes them a happy birthday. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of Friday, December 7th, 1990, a 39-year-old woman named Janet Dennis set 4 dinner plates on the kitchen table at her home in a suburb of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She had just finished making dinner for herself and her 3 kids, who at the current moment were watching a Christmas movie in the living room. Janet hummed along to the TV as she brought the food over to the table, and then she called her kids to come over and eat. The kids got up, they rushed over, they sat down, and as they began eating, Janet told them about all these fun holiday plans that she had made for them over winter break. So Janet really loved Christmas. She typically would decorate her house like the instant Thanksgiving was over. And earlier that same day, she had gone to a toy store and filled the entire backseat of her car with gifts for the kids. But Janet really wanted this Christmas to be especially memorable for her kids, because the past few months had been really tough on them. Back in July, Janet had divorced their father, Leroy, and so now the kids only saw their dad about once a week. Now, Janet knew the kids missed him terribly, but actually, Leroy had never really been a very present father, which was part of the reason that Janet had asked for the divorce in the first place. They'd been married for 16 years, and for most of that time, Janet had pretty much felt like she was just a single parent, on top of being the primary breadwinner for the family. And this was because Leroy owned and operated this ranch that was located about 90 miles away in a rural town called Sealing, and this ranch really had never made much money. And so Leroy had begun working all these crazy long hours to basically avoid hiring extra help, but because of that, he was usually gone before sunrise every single day, and he didn't get home until very, very late. So he's gone all the time working, but for not much return, not much money. And so for years, Janet had picked up the slack. She worked as a school nurse. That way she could, make some money. And then also she could be home to meet the kids after school every single day. And then when she was home, she managed the house by herself as well. And so that was ultimately really why a judge awarded her full custody of the kids back in July when the divorce was finalized. I mean, Leroy undeniably loved his kids, but he simply couldn't provide for them. And besides, at this point, he was now living on that ranch in Sealing, 90 miles away, full time. And so, his kids' schools and social lives were here in Oklahoma City. It wasn't a match. And so now, Janet put another serving of mashed potatoes on her plate. And as she did, she reminded her 12-year-old son, Tad, who was her oldest child, that he had a wrestling tournament at school in the morning, and that they had to leave really early so they could get to the competition on time. After dinner, Tad helped his mom clear the table, and then they all went out to the living room to finish watching that Christmas movie together. And then when it was over, Janet followed her kids upstairs and helped get them all ready for bed. And then once they were all tucked in, she came back downstairs to finish cleaning up the kitchen. Now, this was about the time that Leroy, if they were still married, would be coming home from work. But now that Janet was divorced, she got to spend her evenings however she wanted. She thought about heading out to the garage to grab all those gifts she had purchased out of the car and bring them in to wrap them. But then, as she was about to head out, she saw a pair of headlights pull into her driveway. At 5:30 the next morning, Janet's 12-year-old son, Tad, shut off his alarm clock and rolled out of bed to get ready for his wrestling competition. Once he had his stuff together, he went downstairs, expecting to find his mother in the kitchen already making breakfast. But he didn't see her in there. So he just went down the hallway to her bedroom, and he opened up her door and he looked in, and there was his mom, still lying in bed, with the covers pulled all the way up over her head. So Tad, thinking this whole thing was a little bit odd because his mom was all over everything, he still called out for her to wake up because it was time to get ready to go. But his mom didn't move. And so he walked into the bedroom right next to the bed and pulled down the covers to shake her awake. But when he did that, he realized his mom is not in the bed at all. What he was looking at underneath the covers was actually a pile of pillows, arranged to make it look like she was still sleeping in bed, which was really weird because to Tad, it now seemed pretty obvious that his mother had actually left the house, but for some reason, she seemed to want him to think that she was still home. And so just to make sure, Tad left the bedroom and ran to the garage to check. And sure enough, his mother's car was gone. And now Tad, he really didn't know what to do, because in his entire life, his mother had never just left without telling him. And so Tad went back to the kitchen and he looked over at the clock on the oven and saw it was already 6 a.m., which meant he was already going to be late to his wrestling tournament. He wondered if maybe his mom had just run out to the gas station or something quick like that and she'd be home any minute. But a few more minutes passed by and she still didn't come home. And so at this point, Tad was becoming really anxious and he started to worry that his mom had maybe gotten into a car accident or something. So he did the only thing he could think of. He went over to the kitchen phone and he called his dad, who was out at the ranch in Sealing. And when his dad picked up, he told him everything that was going on. Now, Leroy was, admittedly sort of confused by this whole thing, but he told his son, "Don't worry, your mom's going to be home any minute, I'm sure of it." But he also told him that just in case, he would start driving over to their house right now, just to make sure everything was okay. 2 hours later, Tad heard the sound of his father's truck pull into the driveway. And the instant he heard it, he jumped off the couch to go unlock the front door. When his dad walked into the house, the first thing he asked his son was, "Is mom home?" And Tad said, "No, she's still not here." Leroy nodded, but reassured his son that, his mom was going to be home soon, that she would have a good explanation, it's okay. But, as Tad followed his father all around the house at this point, basically looking for Janet and looking for any sign of maybe where she had gone, Tad began to notice a look of concern growing on his father's face. And that sort of gave Tad this sick feeling in his stomach that maybe something's really wrong here. And then, sure enough, at some point, his dad, after searching the whole house and just sort of standing there for a moment, he turned to Tad and he said, "We got to call the police." 2 days later, on Monday, December 10th, Lieutenant Detective Craig Gravel with the Oklahoma City Police District knocked on the door to Janet Dennis's house. He had spoken on the phone that morning to Janet's ex-husband Leroy, and now he heard Leroy's voice again, but from inside of the house right in front of him, calling to his kids to go on upstairs for a minute. And then a moment later, the door opened and Leroy invited Gravel inside. So even though it had been 2 days now since Leroy had called 911 and reported Janet missing, Gravel had only just been assigned to her case that morning. His captain had wanted to wait out the weekend before investigating formally because there had been no signs of violence at her home, and generally speaking, most adults who get reported missing show up within 48 hours. But that morning, when the case landed on Gravel's desk and he had begun reading over the details, his gut told him that something had happened to her. From all appearances, she was a very responsible and loving mother with no history of just disappearing like this. So, Gravel had immediately put out an alert to all the police stations in the area to be on the lookout for Janet's car, which was a red Chevy Blazer. And then he had called Leroy and asked if they could speak. And so now, Detective Gravel stepped inside of Janet's home, and right away he noticed how tidy and how covered in Christmas decorations it was. I mean, the whole house seemed so festive, which made Gravel think that Janet very likely had planned to be home for the holidays. And so he followed Leroy into the kitchen. They sat down at the table, and the first question he had for Leroy was, "Have you heard from Janet since we spoke this morning?" But Leroy said no. He said all he knew was that Janet had disappeared at some point between maybe 9 p.m. on Friday night when the kids went to bed, and they had seen her when they went to bed, and 6 a.m. the next morning when Tad had called him saying, "Mom's not here." And Leroy said, despite the fact that, Janet is his ex-wife and there wasn't a whole lot of love lost there, he said he was really worried because Janet would never just leave their kids alone. Never. However, he did tell the detective that while he had been just walking around the house for any clues about where she might have gone, he said he had noticed that her toiletries bag was gone. So now he didn't really know what to think. That sort of did suggest that maybe this was planned, but just very out of character. Gravel nodded and then asked Leroy could he think of any place that Janet might go to, maybe to go blow off steam or something, like some place if she was really stressed, where would she go? Leroy said, in the past, Janet had gone to Las Vegas to gamble, but again, she would never just go without warning and also would never just leave the kids unsupervised. Leroy said, at a minimum, she would have let him know if she was going away because, again, they have kids together. Even though they were divorced, they still basically were on decent terms. Gravel nodded and wrote down everything Leroy said. Now, to him, Leroy was definitely a suspect, but at this moment, he seemed to be cooperating. So Gravel wrapped up the interview and headed out because for right now, what he really wanted to do was go speak to another person who had also called the police station that weekend about Janet Dennis. Later that morning, so on Monday, December 10th, 1990, Detective Gravel pulled up to the home of Arthur Olson, who was Janet's father. Arthur had also called the station that weekend, repeatedly, to ask if any progress had been made on his daughter's case. When Arthur opened his door, he looked frazzled, and he asked if Gravel had found his daughter yet, or had any idea where she might be, or if she was okay. Gravel told Arthur that no, they still did not know where she was yet. However, he said that Leroy had told him that occasionally Janet would go to Las Vegas to gamble, to blow off steam. But Arthur echoed the same sentiment as Leroy when he brought this up, which is like, yeah, Janet would occasionally go to Las Vegas, but she would never do that without first making sure her kids were okay. She would never just leave in the middle of the night. That is not something she would do. And also, Arthur said if she had gone to Vegas, like if that's where she was now, she wouldn't be alone. She would have gone with her new boyfriend. And when Arthur said this, that caught Gravel by surprise. Because Leroy, the ex-husband, had definitely not mentioned a new boyfriend. In fact, no boyfriends had been mentioned at all. And so Gravel asked Arthur to tell him more about this boyfriend, because this is the first he was hearing of him. At which point Arthur said, well, my daughter's actually been keeping this boyfriend a secret, both from Leroy and from the kids. Arthur said the guy's name was Jim Umbenhauer, and he was a soldier stationed at Fort Sill, which was an army base just a few towns over. But then this look of regret crossed Arthur's face. He told Gravel that he had actually only just met Jim for the first time this past weekend, after Janet was already missing. And the reason he met with him is he gave Jim a key to Janet's house. Gravel at this point looked up from his notepad and asked Arthur, what does that mean? Why did you do that? Now, Arthur went from looking regretful to looking straight up embarrassed, as he explained. And he told Gravel that just a few hours after Janet was reported missing, Jim had actually called him. And Jim had told him that some of his belongings were actually at Janet's place, and that Janet would definitely not want Leroy to find those things because their relationship was a secret. So Jim had told Arthur that his plan was to wait until Leroy took the kids out somewhere, and then when the house was empty, he would sneak in using the key that he was asking Arthur for, and he would just grab up all his stuff. That way, Leroy wouldn't find it. Gravel, when he heard this, was shocked, because to him it was so obviously a bad idea for Arthur to have given Jim that key. Because as far as Gravel was concerned, Janet's house could be an active crime scene. But Arthur seemed to guess what Gravel was likely thinking here, because he said, he knew now that that had been a mistake. But back on Saturday, he just didn't believe Janet was truly missing here. He expected her to come home. This couldn't be a big deal, right? But now he said he was absolutely sick with guilt. Shortly after this, Gravel wrapped up their interview, and then he hopped in his car, and he drove right back to the station. His top priority now was to track down the secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. But as soon as he got back to his desk, he learned there was actually a more pressing lead for him to follow up on. Janet's car had been located at the Oklahoma City airport. An hour later, Detective Gravel turned his car into the long-term parking garage at the Oklahoma City airport. He was there to follow up on a lead about Janet Dennis, who had disappeared from her house overnight on Friday, leaving her 3 young kids unattended. And right away, Gravel saw another police cruiser at the far end of the garage, parked behind a Chevy Blazer, Janet's Chevy Blazer. And so Gravel, he pulled up behind the other cruiser, and then he got out and just began walking around Janet's car, getting a look. And eventually he walked up and cupped his hands over his eyes so he could look through the window into the back seat. And when he looked in there, he saw it was completely full of new toys, which he assumed were Christmas presents for her kids. And when Gravel saw those presents, he instantly had a bad feeling in his stomach, like his gut was telling him that Janet did not drive her car to this location. Somebody else did. And also, at this point, Gravel also had proof that she wasn't in Las Vegas. So right before Gravel had come out to the airport, his team had called into this centralized database that could access all of the hotel reservations in the Las Vegas area, and there were no reservations anywhere in the entire city under Janet's name. Now, of course, she could be there with somebody else, maybe under their name, but this at least suggested, very strongly suggested, that she was not there. And so now, Gravel was confident that Janet had not skipped town for some spur-of-the-moment gambling trip. Now, at this point, if something had happened to Janet, well, Gravel's primary suspect at this point was Janet's new boyfriend, her secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. However, Gravel still had not looked into him yet, which meant if he was involved in any way in Janet's disappearance, well, by now, he could be anywhere. And so as Gravel is thinking about this, he was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. And he turned and he sees a car pull up right behind his cruiser. And then after they parked, this guy got out wearing a full army uniform, and he walked over to Gravel and he introduced himself as Jim Umbenhauer. Late that afternoon, Gravel sat in an interview room at the station across from Janet's secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer, and Jim was hooked up to a polygraph machine. So back at the airport, Jim had claimed that he'd been worried sick about Janet all weekend, and he'd been literally driving around town looking for her car. He claimed he had no idea that the car, or Detective Gravel, would be at the airport when he arrived. And it had just been like a total coincidence that he had just happened to find Janet's car at the exact moment police had found it. To Gravel, this felt like a fairly obvious lie, because the chances of Jim just running into Janet's car at the exact moment that police are finding it and that he's arriving to look at it, it just felt like not possible. And Gravel figured that Jim must have already known where Janet's car was and had somehow learned that the police had found it, and so he had just sort of shown up. Gravel knew it was actually common for killers and kidnappers to actually intentionally insert themselves into an ongoing investigation of their victims to influence the investigation or just keep a pulse on what's happening under the guise of being really helpful. And right away, Gravel had gotten the sense that Jim was doing just that. So Gravel had immediately asked Jim to not only come back to the station to talk, but to take a polygraph test. And Jim had agreed. And so now the polygraph examiner, so the person actually administering the polygraph, nodded to Gravel that they were ready to start. And so Gravel asked Jim, "Why did you ask for a key to sneak into Janet's house that past weekend?" Now, Jim looked genuinely surprised that Gravel even knew about that. But he told Gravel that he had simply gone over there to get a box of love letters from Janet's bedroom that were between he and Janet. He said that Janet had wanted to keep their relationship private, especially from Leroy. As a precaution, he had, asked Arthur to get the key to go in and get the letters. And he said, the letters were actually right now out in his car. Now, Gravel knew that would be easy enough to verify, so he just moved on. And he asked Jim, "Where were you on Friday night?" which was the last night that Janet's kids had seen her. And Jim actually said that he had been at Janet's house that night, which caught Gravel completely off guard. Jim explained that he had gone over to Janet's house after the kids had gone to sleep so that he and Janet could secretly spend some time together. Now, at this point, Gravel really had to just stop for a second and collect his thoughts before asking more questions, because he really had not seen this coming. I mean, all day he had been trying to place someone at Janet's house after 9 p.m. on that Friday, and now here was Jim admitting he had been there at the house on that Friday night after 9 p.m., making him the official last known person to have seen Janet. After a minute, Gravel told Jim to just go on, tell me more about your last time seeing Janet. And Jim explained that he had stayed at Janet's house for a few hours and he had left really late to drive back to Fort Sill, because he was actually supposed to deploy to Afghanistan the very next day, but when he got back to base that night, he learned that his deployment had actually been delayed for a few weeks. So Jim said the next day he had called Janet's house to tell her the good news, that they had a few more weeks together before he went overseas. But he said Janet didn't answer the phone. A family member had, and they had said that Janet was missing. Gravel just sat back in his chair, taking all this in. To him, it just seemed impossible that Jim would be the last person to see Janet before she just vanished, and then he also just so happened to find her car at the exact moment the police arrived to investigate. So Gravel began asking Jim more questions, predominantly about his personal life. And it was at that point that he learned that Janet was not Jim's only girlfriend. Right now, he was actually living with another woman in a town closer to Fort Sill. Now, Jim admitted that he knew this looked bad, but he swore that the relationship with this other woman wasn't working, and he really just wanted to be with Janet. But Gravel, at this point, felt like he had heard enough. I mean, this guy really had dug himself a hole. And so what he really wanted to do was just discuss the results of this polygraph test with the examiner in private. So he ended the interview and sent Jim home. And once Jim was gone, Gravel turned to the examiner, and the examiner said, "Yep, Jim failed his test," which meant he had been lying throughout the interview. And this was sort of unnerving for Gravel. I mean, because this guy that he had just interviewed very likely was the man responsible for Janet's disappearance. But Gravel knew that he would need more than polygraph results and sort of a gut feeling to arrest Jim and charge him with some sort of crime. Right now, he needed more evidence. A few days later, Detective Gravel was in his office pacing around, reading through some documents. So after his interview with Jim, Gravel had decided to go to the school where Janet worked to speak to her colleagues about her relationship with Jim. Now, he didn't even know if anybody at the school would know about her relationship at all because she had basically kept it secret. And so Gravel had been really surprised to learn that not only did everybody at the school seem to know about Jim, but when they talked about Jim, they spoke with, huge adoration. I mean, they really loved Jim and thought that he was great for Janet. And on top of that, they all seemed to think, sort of collectively, that Leroy was a terrible husband and had been glad when Janet finally dumped him. They said Leroy was very argumentative and he was very controlling, and said the divorce had been really messy. And for Gravel, he found that kind of interesting because until that point, he had thought that Leroy and Janet were basically on good terms. But all of a sudden, it seemed like maybe that was not the case. So Gravel had gotten his hands on a copy of Janet and Leroy's divorce settlement, and those were the documents he was looking through. And as Gravel thumbed through it all, he saw that Leroy actually owed Janet a lot of money, $30,000 plus half of his ranch in Sealing. And that ranch, that was a really big deal because that was Leroy's entire livelihood. So to owe her half on top of the cash was like a huge deal. Plus, Gravel also knew that Janet had been given full custody of their kids. And so the way Gravel saw it, Leroy, he had a lot of reasons to be mad. And Gravel wondered if maybe he had been mad enough to do something to Janet. Just then, the phone on his desk rang and Gravel answered it. It was an undersheriff named Jerry Jones who worked in Dewey County, which is where Leroy's ranch was located. And he told Gravel that he had heard about Janet's disappearance and he wanted to help with the investigation in any way that he could. And he explained that right now there were lots of rumors sort of flying around Sealing that Leroy had killed Janet, and that one of Leroy's neighbors had spotted a big bonfire on Leroy's property just about at the same time that Janet had disappeared. The next day, Gravel was back in the interview room with the polygraph examiner, and this time Leroy was the one sitting across from the table from them, hooked up to the polygraph machine. Now, at first, Leroy definitely seemed nervous about taking this test, like he just seemed anxious. But as soon as they actually started, he quickly relaxed. It was almost like this was no big deal. Gravel began the interview by just asking him basic questions about his relationship with Janet and about their divorce. And Leroy would admit that he and Janet did fight a lot when they were married, and he said initially he had been very upset about owing Janet half of his ranch in Sealing. But he insisted that these days they were basically on good terms, and that he just really tried hard to focus on being a good father. And so not long after these sort of initial questions, Gravel asked Leroy to simply walk him through the night Janet disappeared. Like, tell me where you were, what you were doing. Leroy told Gravel that he had been at his mother's house that night, which was near his ranch in Sealing, and that the two of them just watched TV together and then they both went to sleep. This was the same story that Leroy had already given Gravel a few weeks ago when they first spoke, and Gravel had already called Leroy's mom and she had backed it up. Now, at this point, Gravel really wanted to ask Leroy about that bonfire that someone had spotted on his property. But he didn't want Leroy to know how suspicious of him he was. So Gravel decided that first he would check the polygraph tests so far to see whether Leroy had been truthful throughout the interview. So he asked Leroy to hang tight for a few minutes while he stepped out into the hallway and spoke to the examiner about his test results. Leroy was like, "Okay, great, yep, see you in a few minutes." But as he sat back down, Gravel could see he definitely looked anxious. And so Gravel, he went into the hallway and he walked over to the examiner, and the examiner told him that unfortunately, Leroy's results were inconclusive, which meant that he couldn't tell if Leroy was lying or telling the truth. And so feeling frustrated, Gravel went back into the room and just asked Leroy, "Hey, would you mind taking this test again?" But Leroy, he glanced at his watch and said no. He'd been there for 3 hours already and he had to get home to the kids, so no, he couldn't. He clarified to Gravel that he had actually moved the kids from Janet's house in Oklahoma City back to his ranch all the way out in Sealing because the daily commute had been too hard for him. And so now he had a long drive back home and he just wanted to get going. He also told Gravel that he had heart problems. And so part of him didn't want to take the test again simply because it was too stressful and he was worried about his heart. Now, Gravel thought that was a pretty strange excuse. I mean, the kids were one thing, but heart issues being the reason you can't take a polygraph, that just felt a little fishy. But at the same time, he couldn't force Leroy to stay at the station. Still, he didn't want to come out of this 3-hour polygraph session empty-handed, so Gravel asked Leroy to do one last thing before he left: to sign a consent to search form, which would allow investigators to come out to Sealing and search his ranch. And to Gravel's relief, Leroy said, "Sure." The morning after Leroy took his polygraph test, Detective Gravel made the long drive from Oklahoma City to Sealing, where Leroy's ranch was located, and where Gravel hoped to find the, at this point, body of his missing person, Janet Dennis. The previous night, Gravel had placed a call to Undersheriff Jones, the officer from Dewey County who had volunteered to help with Janet's case. Gravel knew that Leroy's ranch was over 1,500 acres, so it's massive, and that it would likely take weeks to search the entire property. So Gravel had the Undersheriff's recon team actually begin that big search, while Gravel and his team began speaking to some of Leroy's neighbors. And so now, Gravel pulled up a long driveway and parked outside of a big farmhouse, and then after he stopped, he got out and walked up and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a middle-aged woman answered, and Gravel explained who he was, and that he had heard that one of Leroy's neighbors had seen a huge fire on Leroy's property around the time that Janet Dennis had disappeared. And this woman's eyes immediately went wide, and she said that she was the one who had seen the fire, and it had caught her attention because there was a ton of smoke, so it must have been huge. Gravel felt the surge of adrenaline because he had this feeling that this woman was likely about to lead him directly to Janet's body. She was going to show where this fire was. But then a guilty look came across her face, and she apologized to Gravel, and she said, after I had told some people about this fire, I learned that actually the fire I saw had occurred a few days before Janet went missing. And for Gravel, this was truly crushing. But, he asked the woman if she had spotted any other weird behavior on Leroy's ranch, but the woman just said no. And so Gravel ultimately thanked her for her time and then felt completely defeated as he walked back to his car. Gravel spent the next few hours going door to door in the area, asking more of Leroy's neighbors about the rumors flying around town that Leroy had killed Janet. But pretty much everybody said that those rumors were largely connected to the bonfire that actually happened a few days before Janet disappeared, which meant that by the time Gravel headed back to Oklahoma City, he had no actual proof that either Leroy or Jim had been involved in any way in Janet's disappearance. He really barely had any evidence at all that a crime had even occurred. And even though he strongly believed that Janet had been abducted and potentially killed, it was still technically possible that Janet disappeared by choice and was alive and well somewhere. And so at this point, Gravel was completely out of leads, and he would just have to wait to see what would turn up on the ranch at the end of this massive search of the 1,500 acres. 6 weeks later, in early February of 1991, Gravel answered the phone in his office, and the person on the other end of the line said that they had information about Janet Dennis. And this was fantastic news. Because at this point, Gravel's investigation had completely stalled out, nobody knew what happened to Janet, she had not turned up, It was basically dead end after dead end. And also, so far, the search of Leroy's property, which was still ongoing, had yet to turn up anything useful for this investigation. The only other recent development in the case had happened a few weeks ago when Leroy had contacted Gravel about a box of Jim's belongings that he had found at Janet's house. Now, by this point, Jim was no longer a secret. Leroy knew about the secret boyfriend. When Gravel looked inside this box, he found this VHS tape, and it was a pornography tape. Now, it was not like homemade. It was not Janet or Leroy or Jim or anybody. It was, real actors in this pornography tape, but it was a really specific type of pornography. It showed this woman being tied up and burned. Fictional, but that was the script. That's how the pornography went. When Gravel saw this, he wondered if this tape was actually why Jim had tried to get the key from Janet's father to sneak into Janet's house, if the real reason for that was actually to try to find this tape, this, torture porn, and get it out of the house. And so Gravel had actually brought Jim down to the station to question him about the pornography tape, but Jim swore up and down he had no idea where that video came from, and he had even taken another polygraph test, and this time he passed. And so now, Gravel really didn't know what to believe, and he was desperate for really any new information. And so this caller saying they knew something about Janet was like the only positive development in the case that he had seen in quite a while. And the caller said that they actually had remembered something that might be important. And that's when Gravel realized that he recognized the caller's voice. They had actually spoken before. Based on forensic evidence and witness testimony, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Janet Dennis on the night of December 7th, 1990. Late that night, the killer was standing inside of Janet's bedroom by the side of her bed, just watching her sleep. And as they stared at her sleeping, the killer was just filled with rage. Even though on the outside, the killer sort of projected a very affable nature and just was a very calm and very kind person, inside they loathed Janet. And one of the primary reasons they hated her so much is because of her recent decision-making. And so after standing there, just taking in the sight of like the object of their rage, they reached over and grabbed a rag they had soaked in chloroform, which is a chemical that when it's pushed up against your face, it can cause you to pass out if you breathe it in. And the killer, they put this rag right over Janet's mouth until she passed out, because they didn't want her waking up when they inevitably moved her. And then after using the chloroform, the killer grabbed Janet's purse and then also grabbed her toiletries to make it look like she had chosen to leave, to go on a trip somewhere. And then the killer actually lifted Janet up out of the bed, put her on the ground. Remember, she's passed out from this chemical. And then they put pillows in her bed under the sheets and kind of arranged them so at first glance it would look like Janet was still in bed with the covers up over her head. This really was just in case one of the kids came into the bedroom in the middle of the night, they would look and see their mom and they wouldn't think anything of it. And so now, with the pillows in place and with the purse and the toiletries in hand, the killer scooped Janet back up off the ground and then carried her out of the house. And once they were outside, the killer placed Janet's unconscious body in the back of the killer's vehicle, and then they drove her to a nearby house in Oklahoma City that they owned. The killer took Janet inside of this home and tied her up so that even if she woke up from this chloroform, she wouldn't be able to escape. And then the killer drove back to Janet's house, parked their vehicle there, and used Janet's keys they had gotten from her purse to get into her Chevy Blazer. And then they drove her Blazer out to the airport and parked it in the long-term parking lot. Then the killer took a taxi from the airport back to Janet's house, where they got into their own vehicle again and drove back to the house where Janet was tied up. Then the killer put Janet, who was still passed out, back into the killer's vehicle, and they drove her to another house they owned. This one was outside of Oklahoma City. And when they got to this house, the killer dragged Janet out of the back of their vehicle, they put her on the ground, and the killer went and got a shovel and then came back over and smashed her in the head with it until she was dead. And then once Janet was dead, the killer burned her body in the fire pit on their ranch. Janet's killer was her ex-husband Leroy. who just basically hated Janet for getting full custody of their kids, for getting half of his ranch, for him being ordered to pay her $30,000. Like, he hated her and resented her for all that. And then when he found out she was also dating this new guy, Jim, he was consumed by jealousy and decided he needed to do something, which was ultimately to murder his ex-wife. And then after the murder, he invented an alibi and reported Janet missing himself in order to cast suspicion off of himself. But he was ultimately caught because Leroy's neighbor remembered seeing smoke from his burn pit. It was the same neighbor that Gravel had spoken to. She had first thought the fire happened after Janet went missing, and then she changed her mind and thought it happened maybe before. But then, a few weeks later, she checked her calendar and realized she had gotten the date wrong again, and that the fire was actually the day after Janet disappeared. And so she called Gravel right away and said, "I have more information about Janet, and it might be important." And so later that same day, after getting this information, the search team out at the property, out at the ranch, focused their efforts on the burn pits, and they would eventually find Janet's remains. Leroy Dennis was convicted of first-degree murder and ultimately sentenced to life without parole. On Saturday, August 13th, 2011, 19-year-old Wang Weijie was with his friends Ma Jun and Zhou Guo at an internet cafe in the city of Taiping, China, watching Jun play a computer game. Now, Weijie and his friends went to this cafe a lot, and today they had literally been there for hours by this point. But now, as Jun finished up the game he was playing, Guo announced that he was actually ready to go do something else now. So the three of these guys spent a lot of time together, whether it was at an internet cafe or elsewhere. They were like really close friends. And generally speaking, Weijie usually just did whatever Jun and Guo wanted to do, since they both had strong opinions, and Weijie was more of a go-with-the-flow type of guy. And so now, as Guo decided they were done with games, Weijie was just like, all right, cool. Well, why don't we just head back to one of our places just to hang out? But Guo, he shook his head and said, no way, like it's Saturday. They didn't have to be up for school the next day, and so they could stay out all night if they wanted to. And so he said, like, we gotta find something really exciting to do. Like, we gotta make the most of this night. Now, nobody had like a great idea of what was gonna be super exciting. And so Guo was like, all right, well, for now, like, let's just go outside and we can smoke first, and then we can go from there. And at this, both Jun and Weijie just nodded in agreement, like, okay, that's the plan. But in reality, Weijie wasn't really sure if he felt comfortable staying out all night tonight, because tonight was not just a normal night. Like, this was an iffy night to stay out all night. So this particular weekend was not just an ordinary weekend. It was actually the area's annual Ghost Festival, a time on the lunar calendar when ghosts apparently would wander the streets after dark. And Weijie's family, along with his friends' families, and frankly, a lot of other people in this area, they took this festival really seriously. They believed the ghosts really were out wandering the streets after dark because they were just very superstitious. In fact, in this area, this festival was taken so seriously that businesses would often close early so people could safely make their way home before nightfall. Now, Weijie himself didn't really necessarily believe in ghosts, despite his family appearing to very much believe in them. But the reality is Weijie was just not a guy who ruffled feathers. He went with the flow. He was a rule follower. So in his mind, he was thinking, it's the Ghost Festival. Kind of don't want to stay out late tonight. But now, Guo was already making his way towards the exit with Jun, and so Weijie didn't bother to argue. Instead, he just followed right along and they went outside to smoke. About an hour later, Weijie was sitting in the passenger seat of his own car with Jun behind the wheel and Guo in the back, and they were driving down a road in the outskirts of town. And by this point, the sun had set, and so now they were officially in Ghost Festival territory. Like, presumably there are ghosts out now out on the roads. So after leaving the internet cafe, the three of them, they had a smoke, but then as they're out there, they couldn't come up with a compelling idea for how to spend the rest of their big night out. All they came up with is, let's just get in the car and drive around and maybe we'll figure out something to do. Now, initially, when they hopped in the car, they're thinking, okay, it's getting dark out, we're gonna be driving around during the ghost festival. We're bound to find something exciting to do. And so all of them are like, they're amped up. They're in the car. They're pumped. We're gonna find something fun. But after a while, they were just randomly driving around. No one's really out because, again, it's this ghost festival. Everybody's, in their homes. There's nothing going on. And it just became really, really boring. They're just like driving around and nothing's going on. And so at a certain point, Weijia is just feeling so frustrated because it's like he didn't want to be out here in the first place. He didn't voice that to his friends, but like he didn't want to be out here. He just wanted to be home. And so he just was like, man, this is so boring. And he just leaned his head up against the window and just decided to drift off to sleep. And so he's like closing his eyes and he's just laying there. And June, who's driving, is just, driving along. They're not really talking. And so Weijia, as he's laying there, he suddenly feels the car come to a screeching stop. And Guo in the back seat immediately, reflexively screams at June, the driver, like, hey, what are you doing? Drive more carefully. And Weijia, he's like looking around like, what just happened? And he looks over at June, who's driving, and June is not paying any attention to Guo or to Weijia. He's just pointing out the windshield at something on the road, and he's like, look! And so Weijia, who's just sort of confused because a moment ago he was half asleep, he looks from June out the front windshield to see what he's pointing at, and there's this woman who's just sitting in the middle of the road. They're out on the outskirts of town. Like, there's no really any buildings around or anything. Like, they're out in the sticks. And it's dark out, and everyone's home for the Ghost Festival, and there's just this woman sitting on the ground. She's wearing this floral dress, and there's a bike that she has that's next to her, just propped up. And she's almost been hit by a car. Like, they stopped very close to her. She's almost been hit by a car, and she's just sitting there staring blankly at the car. And so June, he's pointing at her like he can't believe it. He almost hit her, and Wei just like, what's going on? And Guo, like, he doesn't even know what to make of it. And at some point, June sort of snaps out of it, and he leans out the window and he yells at the woman to like, get out of the way. Like, what are you doing? Like, get out of the road. But the woman didn't budge. She just sat there staring at them, just on the ground, not a care in the world, just looking right at all three of them. And so eventually, after sort of the tension in the car went down a little bit, June just pulled his head back in the window and he looked at his friends and he's like, I don't know. And he just drove around this woman, just avoided her. And they continued driving along. For the next few hours, the three boys just continued driving around town, looking for something to do, but there still was nothing to do. Everything's basically abandoned because it's this ghost festival night. Nobody's out, no businesses are open, there's nothing to do. And what really had not left any of their minds, even though they really didn't talk about it, was that woman. Like, that was so unusual to just see her sitting there, not reacting to nearly being hit. Like, the whole thing was just so creepy, made more so because it's the night of this ghost festival. Like, talk about the creepiest night to see something like that. And so eventually, around like 1 a.m., when the boys are still just driving around, someone in the car suggests like, hey, let's go back to that intersection and see if she's still there. Like, let's just see what she's doing. Now, keep in mind, it's been hours since they've seen this woman, like hours. And so they drive back around, not really expecting to see her there. They think that, like, no matter how weird that was, she has to have gotten up and left by now. But no, they turn onto that road, which again is outside of the town. It's like there's no buildings around. It's dark, minus their headlights. And they drive down this road, and sure enough, off in the distance, still sitting in this intersection, is this woman. She's unmoved. She's just sitting there in her dress with a bike next to her, just hours later, no change. And so now it's like the boys can't help but feel really uneasy here. Like, this isn't right. Something's wrong with this woman. I mean, also they can't help but think like, it's the night of the ghost festival. Are we seeing a ghost? Like, they're terrified. I mean, that's the reality, is they were scared. But really, more than anything, what all three of them are thinking and discussing in the car is, we gotta tell someone about her. Like, there's something wrong with this woman. What is she doing? Is she mentally unwell? Is she on drugs? We don't know, but like, this isn't okay. We gotta tell someone. But for now, the three boys decided that they had had enough fun for one night, and they drove to June's house, and they just all crashed there, determined to figure out what to do with this woman and what they saw the next day. And so several hours later, the boys wake up, they make their way into the kitchen because they can hear June's mom is in there making breakfast. And right away, June tells his mom what happened the night before. And as he's regaling her in the details of the story, June and Guo also chimed in with their perspective. And then after they were done telling June's mom, they all sort of expected her, being an authority figure, to know what to do. That she would very likely say, okay, we need to call the police, or we need to call a hospital, or we need to call some other authority figure and handle this professionally. But she didn't do any of that. Instead, she just kind of looked at the boys and she said, "You saw a ghost." You can predict the summer soccer showcase action all the way to the final match with FanDuel Predicts. All you have to do is sign up to get your $25 bonus. I downloaded FanDuel Predicts during one of the matches just to try it, and let me tell you something. Every play suddenly mattered way more, and every pass had a little more weight to it. It's all right there on your phone, super easy, and it kind of pulls you into the action in a way that just watching doesn't. Sign up now for your $25 bonus on FanDuel Predicts. Go to fanduel.com/predicts to sign up. That's fanduel.com/predicts to get your $25 bonus. Offered by FanDuel Prediction Markets, LLC, a registered futures commission merchant, 18+. Bonus is non-withdrawable and expires 7 days after receipt. Trading derivatives involves significant risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Manage your activity with their consumer protection tools. Restrictions apply. See terms at fanduel.com/predicts/bonus-offer-terms. Now, at first, all three boys were just shocked at how confidently and calmly she said this. I mean, of course they knew about the annual Ghost Festival. And of course, people in this town were very superstitious, including their own families. They knew this meant a lot, this festival. But the idea that we're going to sit here and literally say that the woman we saw sitting on the ground last night was a literal ghost, that seemed crazy. And the boys began saying as much to June's mom. But June's mom was just really annoyed with them and just basically shot them down and said, look, you saw a ghost, but that's the reason you're not supposed to be out on the night of the annual Ghost Festival. It's why the business is shut down. It's why we all go home before nightfall. You knew you weren't supposed to be out at night. You were. That's why this happened. Not to mention, these ghosts, they don't just wander around. They target people. You were targeted. Now, June's mother was not just throwing that out there. She was referencing one other aspect of this annual Ghost Festival that lots of people in this area believed, which was these ghosts that wandered around after dark on this one night of the year, they weren't just wandering around. They were looking for people to effectively latch onto. And so part of the reason people believed you need to stay in at night and avoid being out after dark is because if you basically interact with one of these ghosts, they could latch onto you and then you become its target. In some cases, people believe it just produces really bad luck for you for potentially months at a stretch. Some other people say that once you've been targeted by one of these ghosts, they may try to kill you. Specifically, they may try to drown you. And so no one really knew, but it was like this belief that you just never want to interact with a ghost because it could be very bad for you. And so June and Guo, they still tried to argue a little with June's mother, trying to tell her that no, this could not possibly be a ghost, but their voices seemed less forceful now, and Weijia, he was sitting there thinking actually, if that was a ghost, this kind of makes sense. It explains why she didn't react at all to nearly being hit by a car. She just sat there. Also, why is she just sitting there? Strange activity for anybody to be doing. Maybe a ghost would do that. It also kind of explains why she was still there hours and hours later, just sitting in the middle of the road. Other cars must have gone by. This is not normal behavior. And so Wei just thinking, wait a minute, maybe this was a ghost. However, just as Weijia really started to feel almost sick with worry about, the seriousness of what had happened, he heard June's mom tell them, don't be afraid. She said, look, I know exactly what you need to do to stay safe. Later that same day, Weijia parked his car at a cemetery that was near June's house. And after he parked, he and June got out while Guo stayed behind in the car. All three of them were very tense. They were very anxious. And as Weijia scanned the headstones and looked over at a cornfield that was next to the cemetery, all he was thinking is this ghost woman is going to appear at any moment and she's going to do something to us. But she didn't. And so eventually, Weijia and June began walking down the path that would lead them through all the gravestones, basically deeper into the cemetery. So the reason these two were here and now walking into the cemetery is because they were following June's mother's advice for how to stay safe now that they had potentially come in contact with this ghost. And so they had gone out and acquired a stack of ghost money, and now they were going to go spend it. So ghost money is a kind of paper sheet in China that typically is burned when a loved one dies. The idea is when you burn this money, it sort of goes to the deceased loved one, and then they have money for the afterlife. You're basically giving your deceased loved one currency for the afterlife. But it can also be a way to buy protection from angry spirits. So Weijia and his friends have been told to burn ghost money over their family grave plots so that their dead ancestors could essentially pay the ghost, the evil ghost, to leave them alone. Now, they'd already done this at Guo's family plot in a separate cemetery, so that's why Guo was staying back in the car, and now they were going to do Jun's family plot in this cemetery. And so Weijia and Jun, they continue walking through the cemetery until finally they reach some of Jun's ancestors' graves. There, they knelt down, they pulled out their ghost money, and they began to burn the bills. And they're both just kneeling there, burning this money. And with each, bill that crumpled up and smoldered, both of them were feeling like this enormous wave of relief coming over them. And so for a little while, they're just burning their money, and they're both looking down at the money on the ground. They're just kneeling there. But then at some point, Weijia just looked up. And as soon as he did, he froze. Because standing right behind Jun can't see this, right behind Jun is that woman in a dress. And she's looking at both of them. And Weijia was so scared, he shrieked, he jumped up, turned, and started running in the opposite direction. Now Jun is so startled by Weijia screaming that he jumped up, ready to run away himself, but he's watching Weijia take off, and he turns around because he could tell Weijia saw something behind him, but there's nothing behind him. And he's thinking he must have seen the ghost, because why else would he react this way? But there's nobody here. And so Jun sort of put together, like, what's going on here? Like, Weijia clearly spooked himself. We're in a cemetery after all. And he sees Weijia, and he's running, and he disappears into the cornfield that was next to the cemetery. He's just gone, just running, he's gone. Now, this cornfield was pretty massive. It had not been harvested, so the stalks were really tall. And clearly, like, Weijia was on a mission, and so Jun was not about to just chase after him. Instead, he ran back to the car and he grabbed Guo first, and the two of them went after Weijia. However, when they got to the cornfield and actually went inside of it, they quickly realized it was going to be really hard to find anything in this cornfield. I mean, the stalks are so thick and tall, it's so dense. I mean, every step was so slow and difficult, and they're calling out for Weijia, but there's no response. And so after several minutes of only moving, like 10, 15 feet or so into this cornfield, making no progress, the two of them are like, what happened to him? Like, either the ghost got him, or like maybe he's in hiding somewhere. Maybe he's convinced that the ghost is nearby and he's just being quiet and he's in hiding and he's somewhere in this cornfield, but we gotta find him. And so the two friends, they back out of the cornfield and they end up calling a bunch of their friends to meet them at this cornfield and help them look for Weijia. So all these friends, they eventually arrive, and all day and into the night, these friends search this cornfield. They're looking everywhere for Weijia. Everyone's screaming his name, but there's no sign of him. 3 days later, and Weijia still had not been found. Now, by this point, the parents, Weijia's parents, had been told. They had told police. Police had looked for Weijia, but there was no sign of him. I mean, they were still out looking for him, but right now, like, the talk of the town was, where is Weijia? Nobody knew. And so on this day, 3 days after the day that Weijia went missing, Jun was sitting in his room just feeling miserable. All he can think about is his friend and what happened to him. Like, he ran off after presumably seeing this ghost. Like, did the ghost get him? Like, all these horrible thoughts are going through his head. And Jun, as he's sitting in his room, he hears his mom call out to him, telling him there's a visitor. And so Jun, he gets up, he leaves his room, he goes to the front of the house, and he sees a police officer standing in the doorway. And this officer would tell Jun and his mother that they had found Weijia, and he was dead. His body was found in a lake that was not far from the cemetery, and that he had drowned. Jun is completely shocked. I mean, on the one hand, he sort of was expecting bad news at this point. I mean, basically everybody was. But to hear that his friend was dead was just horrific, and he really struggled to keep back tears. But, before he could really even react to this, The officer went on to say that, June, we spoke to Wage's parents and they told us that you and Guo were with their son last, that you were with him before he vanished. And so we just want you to tell us, now that we know he passed away, that he drowned, we want to know what happened. What did you see? Like, what led to him drowning? And June, he just launched into the most detailed version of the story he could possibly think of. He took the officer all the way back to them at the internet cafe, playing computer games. They decide they're going to stay out all night. They go outside, they're having a smoke, they're talking about what they're gonna do. They decide they're gonna get in the car and just drive around. They're driving around on the night of this ghost festival. They see this woman, they think it's a ghost. Like, he went through this whole rendition of the ghost being really central to this story, and how the next day June's mom had said, oh, go burn ghost money in the cemetery to protect yourself from the spirits. They go to the cemetery and they're burning the ghost money, but then Weija, he gets so scared. June's convinced it's because he sees the ghost again, this woman, and he takes off running into the cornfield. So he tells the officer every little detail. And he knew that even in a place like this, where people did, for the most part, believe in ghosts, he knew his story really hinged on a ghost made Weija do this. And he knew that it was totally preposterous in some ways, but he thinks he's telling him the truth. And so he tells the officer all this stuff. And the officer's just staring at him, and he's clearly very skeptical. And then at some point, after June is done, and he's just waiting for the officer looks at him, and he asks him one question that once he answers honestly, it completely explains everything that happened. It would turn out that woman who was sitting in the middle of the road that sort of became the centerpiece of this whole ordeal was not a ghost. In fact, she wasn't even real. Because the three friends, June, Guo, and Weija, on the night they decide to have their big night, they're going to stay out all night. When they went out for a smoke, they didn't smoke cigarettes. They smoked methamphetamine, which can cause you to hallucinate. And so they were high on meth driving around and hallucinated that woman. But they all, believed they saw it, and it felt so real, and it was on the same night as this annual ghost festival that it felt so real that even the next day, when they were no longer high, they still believed they had seen it. And then June's mom confirmed, yep, that was a ghost, because she believes in ghosts. And so they set out to the cemetery, and they're gonna, burn this ghost money to save themselves from these evil spirits. And what do before they head out to the cemetery? They smoke more meth. And Weija, he has another hallucination. He thinks he sees the ghost, ran into the cornfield, not realizing that deep in the cornfield was a lake. He fell into it, and he was high on meth and didn't know how to swim, and so he drowned. On the night of August 28, 2004, a 21-year-old named John Hutcherson leaned over a bar in Marietta, Georgia, and asked the bartender for another beer. John, by this point, had completely lost track of how many drinks he had had in the past few hours, but he was sure it had been a lot, because by this point, the room was starting to spin. However, he had no plans to stop drinking anytime soon. After all, it was only midnight, which was very early for John, and he was having a great time, and the bar was packed, and there was loud music playing, and John was also on a winning streak playing pool. And so while he waited for his beer, John looked over at the pool table. He had left his best friend Frankie there a few minutes ago, but now, as he was looking over there, he didn't see Frankie anymore. So John and Frankie had been very close ever since high school, and this night out they were having was sort of like a typical Saturday for them. Every week they would meet at this bar, they would get exceptionally drunk, and they would basically stay out all night. But on this night, they were both a lot drunker than usual, and now Frankie was gone. And so as John very drunkenly looked around the bar to see if he could find Frankie, he noticed a girl he didn't recognize at the end of the bar. She was very cute, and she appeared to be smiling at him. And so, John sees her and forgets all about his friend Frankie being gone and just smiles back at this girl. And then a moment later, the bartender hands him his beer, and John's feeling really confident. He takes his beer and he begins walking towards this girl. However, before he actually reached her, he he felt a hand on his arm, and he turned to see Frankie, who looked just awful. He looked so pale, he smelled like vomit. And Frankie told John, as well as he could, because he's so drunk, he's mumbling everything. He just said he felt horrible and it was time to go. Now, John was really disappointed because even though he was really, really drunk too, he wasn't as bad as Frankie. Like, John had not reached the nauseous and vomiting phase of extreme intoxication. And so he's thinking, man, like, there are a couple more hours till closing and I really want to talk to this girl. But he was Frankie's ride, and Frankie had to go home, clearly, and so if he was going home, John had to go home too. So John just chugged his beer, put it back on the bar, and then he turned and kind of waved at the girl, being like, sorry, I gotta go. And then John pulled his car keys out of his pocket. And so John and Frankie, they head outside to the parking lot, and John goes to his truck, and he climbs into the driver's seat. And as he's fumbling with the keys to start the car, Frankie had gone around to the other side and stumbled his way into the passenger seat. And even though he's like wrecked drunk, he's like totally out of it, Frankie looks over at John and sees him unable to even start the car. And he's like, hey, are you sure you're good to drive? And John looks over at Frankie and he's like, of course, I'm just fine. I do this every single week. We always get home safe. And so at this point, Frankie's like, all right, whatever, let's just go. And so John, he eventually manages to turn the car on. He throws it in gear. And he began to pull out of the parking lot onto the road, but as he did, he really had to squint his eyes just to see the road clearly. His whole world is totally spinning because of how intoxicated he was. And then as soon as he actually began driving down the main road on the way home, the first thing he did is he's like hitting the curb and swerving back onto the road, but he was, basically steady. He's totally wasted, but he's basically hanging on. And then the rest of the drive was just a blur. John was white knuckling it the rest of the way, He's driving along, he sees the gas station that he always passed on the way home, so that's a familiar landmark, he's going the right way. He eventually passes a familiar billboard, but then at some point his eyes like snap back into focus because he realizes he's swerving off the road onto the shoulder, but he swerves back just in time to avoid hitting a telephone pole. And he's like, oh man, like I got this, like stay focused. And then somehow, some way, eventually he winds up in front of Frankie's house. And so he drops his friend off and then back on the road he goes, navigating now at this point, like with one eye shut. And he eventually finds his way to his parents' house where he was staying. And from there, he climbed out of his car, he walked up the driveway, he unlocked the front door, and then stumbled up to his room where he immediately just fell into his bed and passed out. The next thing John knew, he heard voices, and then he felt somebody grab his arm and shake him. And then when he opened his eyes, his vision was very blurry, but eventually it came into focus and he saw that he was clearly in his bedroom, in his bed, on top of his blankets, but he had no idea how he got there. He looked down and noticed he was still wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before, but they were sticky and they were dirty. And then there were also these two figures who were standing over him, repeating his name over and over again, almost angrily. John looked at these two and didn't really know who they were, but then he noticed they were both wearing matching uniforms. They were police officers. And these officers were very angrily asking John, what happened last night? Like, what did you do? What happened the night before? But John, he still is sort of trying to figure out what's even going on. He really doesn't have a good memory of anything that happened the night before. All he can just quickly remember is he was at that bar, he saw that girl, he drove Frankie home, he knew he was drunk on the ride home, but he got home. He didn't know what else they were trying to figure out about what happened the night before. And so when he finally opened his mouth to be like, what is going on? Because he was still basically drunk, it just came out of his mouth like this incoherent babbling. He was like, what's going on here? And the two officers, they were just over it, and they just grabbed John and literally pulled him out of the bed. They whipped his hands behind his back, they handcuffed him, and John, who's like, what is happening? They lead him out of his bedroom, downstairs, past his mom and dad, who are staring at him like, what is going on? And even though John, again, is basically borderline incoherent, in passing by his parents, he's hoping they're gonna be like, hey, officers, why are you arresting my son? But instead, as he's led past them, he looks at his mom and dad, and they're not about to put up some fight. They're crying. They're holding each other and crying. They clearly know something bad has happened, and they can't stop what's happening to their son. And so the officers, they walk John in handcuffs out the front door, and they walk him over to his truck in the driveway. And when they got there, the officers just stopped and gestured for John to have a look inside. And so John, he's sort of looking at the officers like, okay, what's going on with my truck? And he turned and he just sort of squinted and looked through the window into the car. And there was this large object in the passenger seat that he didn't remember being there the night before. Then as he looked more closely, he realized with horror what it was. So the night before, John did drive when he absolutely should not have. He was clearly way past the legal limit for driving. He should never have been driving, totally unsafe for others, for him. Shouldn't have happened, but he did. He drove. And so he and Frankie, they're driving home, and John, in his limited memory, recalled, this sort of like blurry ride home, where basically as dangerous as it was, he got them home. But at one point, he remembered almost hitting a telephone pole, and he swerved just in time, and he narrowly avoided it. And in some ways, that was true. He did avoid smashing into the telephone pole, but he didn't avoid an incident. So Frankie, because he was so nauseous from having drank too much, he had his head out the window as they were driving along, trying to get some fresh air. And when John drove too close to that telephone pole and swerved at the last second, Frankie's head was still out the window, and his head was decapitated by one of the tension wires coming off the pole. The tight wire that holds that pole into the ground, one of them, it's like a guillotine, and they're speeding past it, and Frankie's neck hit the wire, off went his head. But his body remained in the passenger seat of the car, and John was so belligerently drunk that he didn't see he had just killed his friend, nor did he see his friend's body, or a part of his body, still in his car. And so when John drunkenly arrived at Frankie's house, and he's like, all right, bye, he thought maybe Frankie got out of the car, but clearly he didn't. He was just there, dead, in his passenger seat. And then John just drove back to his parents' house and just left the car in the driveway with his friend's body inside, and up to his bedroom he went and passed out, having no idea what he had just done. A few months later, John would plead guilty to vehicular homicide, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. On the night of October 1st, 1999, a 75-year-old man named Steve Beard sat on the patio of his mansion in Austin, Texas, sipping on a cocktail. And it was a great night. Warm evening, the leaves rustling in the trees all around his property, and behind his house there was this creek that was flowing along. And in the house, he could hear his wife Celeste washing the dishes. So Steve had met Celeste only about 6 years ago. It was actually shortly after his first wife, Elise, had died of cancer. And Steve had been with his first wife for 45 years, and they'd raised 3 kids together. And he'd just been totally lost after she had passed away. And really, after she had died, he had spent a lot of nights just sitting alone at the Austin Country Club, where actually Celeste had been working as a waitress. Celeste was only 30 years old at the time, which meant she was almost 40 years younger than Steve. But there had been an immediate spark between them, and they got married just over a year later. Now, some of Steve's friends and family had immediately assumed that, given this age gap, that Celeste was simply after Steve for his money. Steve, after all, had made a fortune as a business owner and a TV station executive, and he was worth about $10 million. But Steve knew that money could not possibly be the only thing Celeste saw in him. I mean, he knew that he took great care of Celeste, and also he took great care of her twin teenage daughters. I mean, he really helped give Celeste and her girls the stability that they desperately needed. However, despite that stability, one thing that Celeste had always struggled with for much of her life was depression. And in fact, earlier that year, it had gotten so bad that Celeste had actually tried to end her own life. And, she had failed, she had lived, but as a result of that attempt, she'd spent a few weeks in a psychiatric hospital. Now, of course, that was a really traumatic and awful thing for the family, But from Steve's perspective, the upside of this was that Celeste was put on some new medication as a result of this hospital stay. She had made some good friends, actually, while she was at the hospital. And to Steve, it just seemed like, maybe now things were starting to maybe turn around for Celeste. And to Steve, the fact that Celeste appeared to be on the right path again was great timing, because recently Steve had actually been dealing with health problems of his own. Twice in the past few months, Steve had passed out and actually had to be hospitalized himself. The doctors told him he had high blood pressure, sleep apnea, and he had some heart and kidney issues, but they actually couldn't quite figure out why he was fainting. They just knew he had, several symptoms going on. Now, Steve thought it was very likely stress-related, and he just needed to relax. So in fact, in 2 days from now, he was going to be taking Celeste on a 3-week vacation around Europe. After everything Celeste had been through that year, and also, Steve had been through as well with his own medical issues, he felt like they both could use some time away, just the two of them. But now, when Steve got up from his seat out on the patio of his home and he put the empty cocktail glass down on the table and he turned and he opened the glass door that led into the bedroom, he saw that even though he'd already packed his suitcase for this European trip, several days ago, Celeste's suitcase was still empty in the closet. And Steve couldn't help but feel like it seems like Celeste might be getting cold feet about this European vacation. Like she should have been packed already and she's clearly putting it off. So Steve left the bedroom and he went down the hallway and went into the kitchen where he found Celeste cleaning up. And when he got in there, as gently as he could, he told Celeste, hey, when you get a chance, you really ought to pack. And she told him, oh, don't worry about it. She'd just been busy all week. She'd get to it. Steve nodded, but wasn't really convinced that she actually intended to pack soon, but he said, okay. And then he looked over at the clock, and even though it was barely 9 p.m., he felt exhausted. So he told Celeste he was going to go to bed, and she told him that she actually intended to stay up for a bit longer. One of her daughters was having a sleepover at the family's lake house that night, and she said that she might go over there and just check on them later. Celeste told Steve that when she returned from doing that, she would sleep in a different room to avoid waking him up. Steve thanked her and gave her a kiss goodnight, and then he turned and walked back down the hallway, back into the bedroom. He got ready for bed, climbed into bed, and then he put on his oxygen mask because he had sleep apnea, and then he pulled the covers up, and he drifted off to sleep. Hours later, around 3 a.m., Steve woke up, and immediately he felt this horrible pain in his stomach. And even though it was dark in his room, he looked down, he's got the mask still on his face, and he could tell there was something on his stomach. And he reached down instinctively and he grabbed at his stomach and he felt something wet on his hands. And so in a panic, he ripped off his mask and he kind of sat up to look down at his abdomen. But as he did, just the pain he felt intensified so much just by trying to sit up that he fell back down. And so he reached over and he clicked on the light and he looked down and there was blood all over his stomach, like all over the sheets everywhere. And so he begins screaming out for Celeste. And as he's screaming, like the pain is only getting worse and worse, and Celeste is not coming in the room. She's not even responding. And so as he's looking down, like completely panic-stricken, watching all this blood coming out of his gut, he has no idea how this is happening. He just reached over and grabbed the phone and he dialed 911. Just minutes later, a squad car from the Travis County Sheriff's Department pulled up outside of Steve's house with its lights flashing. Deputy Alan Howard climbed out of that car and he saw a fire captain and another pair of deputies on the front step pounding on the door. All Deputy Howard knew was that a man in this home had called in with some kind of medical emergency, but the dispatcher had not quite understood what was wrong with him. And so Howard just ran over to the front door, and there the other deputies told him that so far nobody was answering their knocks. Howard knew at this point, time is of the essence. They had to get in and make sure this person was okay, and so he didn't want to just sit out here and wait any longer. So he left the front porch and he went along the side of the house to see if there was maybe another door that was unlocked somewhere else. And so as Howard went around to the side of the property, the other deputies followed him. And then Howard, he eventually found this flight of stairs that went up to a patio attached to a bedroom. And so up Howard went, the deputies followed, they got up there and they looked into the house and they saw a light was on. And then through the glass door, they could all see there was an elderly man laying in bed with a telephone receiver in one hand, and his other hand appeared to be just covered in blood. Howard walked up to the door and tried to open it, but it was locked. So he pulled out his heavy-duty flashlight and he broke the glass, reached in, unlocked it, and slid the door open. Then Howard ran into the bedroom, and when he got right next to the bed, he looked at this man who was still conscious, but he had a gaping hole in his stomach, like his intestines were literally spilling out, and that's why his other hand was so covered in blood. It was like he was trying to hold his intestines inside of himself. Howard asked the guy what happened, and the old man just said he had no idea. He'd just woken up and his guts were coming out. At this point, the fire captain came into the room, and while he knelt down with his first aid kit to try to bandage up this man's wounds, Howard began looking around the bedroom for any clue about what was going on here. And he noticed something that was round and yellow lying on the carpet. So he bent down to get a better look, and he saw that the round yellow thing was a shotgun shell. And so at this point, it seemed fairly obvious that this man has been shot in the stomach with a shotgun. But Howard's also realizing that whoever pulled the trigger might still be in the house. So at this point, Howard drew his own weapon and he crept slowly out into the hallway. And as Howard began searching the rest of the house, he didn't find anybody, but what he did find is there were lots of other entry points into the home, lots of doors and windows. And eventually, when he found his way into the living room, he saw there was another set of sliding glass doors, and he walked right up to it and he found they were unlocked. Howard also saw that a table lamp in this living room was overturned, suggesting that somebody might have knocked it over while coming in or out of the house. And so Howard continued searching the living room, and then he found his way into the dining room, and then the kitchen, and then he went down a hallway into another wing of the house, and there he opened another door to a bedroom, and he found there was a woman inside, sleeping in her bed, totally sound asleep. At this point, Howard lowered the weapon, and he flipped on a light, and the woman immediately startled awake. And she was about to ask, what's going on here? But Howard just stopped her and he told her that he was with the sheriff's department and they were here responding to a 911 call. And he told her that the man in the other room was very badly injured and he had called 911. And so the woman, as she's processing what she's being told, she began sobbing hysterically and then just begged Howard not to let her husband die. And then a second later, in the midst of all this chaos, this teenage girl comes running in the room and goes right to the woman, and she grabs her the way a child would grab their mother, and they're sort of holding each other, and Deputy Howard, he's looking for potentially a shooter in the house. But just from the looks of it, it appeared very much like this is a woman who's very shocked, very shaken up by this. The girl, the teenager as well, appears equally shocked. But just to be sure, Howard asked this woman to identify herself, and through tears, she would say that her name was Celeste Beard, and that very likely the victim here, the person you're talking about, the man, is her husband, Stephen Beard. And then she also said that the teenage girl was her daughter. And so now, Howard, feeling pretty confident that these are just victims, he told them to just stay put, that he was going to search the rest of the house and just make sure that the house was safe. And so Howard, he leaves the room, he can still hear them crying behind him, and he searches the rest of the house. Huge house, but he searches every room. And there's nobody there. And so it appeared that whoever had shot Steve was gone.
This is a paid partnership with ZocDoc. We spend a lot of time researching cases where things went wrong, where people ignored warning signs and told themselves everything was fine until it wasn't. Unfortunately, health can be similar. Most of us know we should go to the doctor more, but the process of finding one is its own ordeal. I've definitely put off appointments before, not because they weren't important, but because finding a doctor and checking insurance and getting something scheduled just felt like a bigger hassle than it should have been. ZocDoc is a free website that changes the way you find and book doctors. Search for local in-network providers, filter by insurance, read verified patient reviews, and see appointment openings all in one place. No phone calls, no hold music, just find someone, see availability, and book instantly online. 150,000 providers across 200 plus specialties in all 50 states. Appointments usually happen within 24 to 72 hours. Don't wait for a warning sign to become something worse. Your health matters. Head to ZocDoc.com/Mr. Ballin or click the link in the description to book today. Thanks to ZocDoc for partnering with us.
Around 5:30 a.m. on October 2nd, 1999, so about 2.5 hours after Steve Beard called 911, Sergeant Paul Knight walked through the waiting room at a hospital in Austin, Texas. Knight was a criminal investigator for the Travis County Sheriff's Department, and he'd been called in to lead the investigation into this shooting. Knight stopped at the front desk and he spoke to a nurse, who told him that Steve Beard was in critical condition, so questioning him would not be possible right now. Sergeant Knight nodded and gave the nurse his card and asked them to give him a call if Steve's condition ever stabilized. As Knight turned to leave, he quickly scanned the waiting room, and he saw in the corner there was a deputy speaking to a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, as well as a teenage girl. The deputy waved to Knight and called him over, and so Knight went over and he introduced himself. The woman told Knight that she was Steve's wife, Celeste, and the girl was her daughter, Christina. And Knight, he said hello to them, but he knew that he had to do something that was going to come off as pretty insensitive, but he really had to do it as soon as possible. So after just, exchanging some pleasantries, he sat down and pulled out a gunpowder residue test kit. And then he asked Celeste and Christina if he could swab their hands before they began really getting into any sort of conversation here. And Celeste looked really surprised and asked if she was a suspect. And Knight explained that really at this point, everybody was a suspect. And so swabbing them for gunpowder would be the quickest way to rule them both out. So Celeste, who was still very clearly shaken up, she just put both her hands out, and Knight ran a test strip across both of them. And then after that, Christina put her hands out and he tested her hands as well. And then he waited for the test strips to develop. And about a minute later, he confirmed that they were both negative, meaning neither of them had fired a gun recently. And so with this test out of the way, Knight's entire demeanor sort of softened, and he asked Celeste to just walk him through what had happened that night. She told him that her husband, Steve, had gone to bed around 9 or 9:30, and shortly after that, she had left their home and driven over to the family's lake house to check on her other daughter, Jennifer, and her friends who were having a sleepover there. She said the lake house was about a half an hour away, and so by the time she finally came back after checking on Jennifer and the other girls, she said it was about midnight. And, she walked in the house and it was quiet, there was nothing unusual, and she said she went straight to bed. And she said she actually chose to sleep in a different room than Steve because Steve had gone to bed earlier and she had told him she didn't want to wake him up if she came home late. And so she was doing him a courtesy by sleeping in this other room. Knight asked Celeste if she knew anybody who might be mad at her husband or who might want to hurt him for any reason, and she said no. But she did say that the previous afternoon, her husband had gone out and cashed a really big check. He was going to give some cash to her twin daughters, while she and Steve were going to be in Europe. He wanted to give the kids some spending money while they were away, and it was quite a bit of money. And so she said, maybe somebody at the bank saw him cashing that check, knew he had a bunch of money on him. Maybe they followed him home to rob him. And so Knight and Celeste spoke for a little bit longer. And then when Knight was done questioning her, Celeste got up and said she was going to go outside and smoke a cigarette. And as she left, Knight turned to her daughter, Christina, and asked her about what she'd seen and heard from the previous night. Christina said she had been asleep all night until around 3:30 in the morning when she had woken up to police lights flashing outside her window. And as she continued to tell her story of what happened, Knight noticed that she was being really careful about what she was saying. Not like she was trying to remember some concocted story, but rather it was like she was literally trying her best to actually remember. Like she was struggling to remember just what amounted to a pretty traumatic and very, chaotic night. But before Knight could ask any more follow-up questions, another girl, another teenager, who looked exactly like Christina, ran into the waiting room, and immediately Christina got up to go over and hug her. And when the two girls pulled away from each other, Knight noticed that both of these girls were sobbing, and they really were just identical. Christina introduced this new girl as her twin sister, Jennifer. And then just a few seconds after that, two teenage boys came through the hospital door, and they hurried over to join the group. And as they all sat down, Christina explained that the two boys were her and Jennifer's boyfriends. After Christina briefly updated her sister Jennifer and the two boyfriends about the condition of her stepfather, Knight turned to Jennifer and just asked her to please walk him through where she had been, the previous night. And Jennifer would say, she had been at the family's lake house, she was there with her boyfriend and one other friend, she'd been there all night. And then when they had found out something had happened to Steve, they had all rushed here as soon as they could. And so Knight, he asked the girls if either of them knew anyone who might want to harm their stepfather. And as soon as he asked that, Knight noticed the two teenage girls, they shared this quick, knowing look between themselves. At this point, Christina turned back to Knight and said, there was only one person she could think of who would do something like this, a woman named Tracy Tarleton. She explained that Tracy was a friend of her mother's, and they'd met earlier that year at a psychiatric hospital where they had both been patients. But Christina said there was just something off about their friendship. Tracy seemed like really unstable, and Christina got the feeling that she was actually in love with their mom. And as soon as she said this, all four of the teens just sort of nodded knowingly, like this was something they definitely had talked about internally. And then they all began to agree out loud that Tracy very likely was the one who did this. And then a minute later, a fifth teenager came running into the hospital and they joined the group, and Jennifer introduced her as another friend. Her name was Amy Cozart, and she had been the other friend sleeping over at the lake house that night. And Amy, who literally had just joined and heard, no context to this point about anything the other teenagers had said, when she was asked pretty much right away by Knight if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Steve, she didn't hesitate. She just said, "Oh, Tracy Tarleton." Later that afternoon, around 3 o'clock, Sergeant Knight knocked on the front door of Tracy Tarleton's very unassuming ranch-style house in a working-class part of Austin, Texas. While running a check on Tracy to confirm her address, he'd also discovered that she had a weapons permit for a 20-gauge shotgun, the same caliber as the casing that was found inside the crime scene. Tracy answered the door pretty much right away, as if she had been waiting for someone to come by. And Knight, after introducing himself, told her that Steve Beard had been shot. And when he said this, he didn't notice any shock on Tracy's face. Instead, Tracy actually looked scared. Knight asked Tracy if she had any idea who might have shot Steve. And she said no, but then she asked if she needed a lawyer. And Knight said, "Well, that's up to you." And then before she could really react to that, he asked her if he could come inside. And Tracy just sort of turned and led him into the living room. Knight walked in, he sat down, and he just continued talking to Tracy. And so he asked her about her relationship with Celeste. And she said that yes, they had met at a psychiatric hospital when they were both being treated earlier that year for suicide attempts. And then, sort of unannounced, she told the detective that at first, when she had met Celeste, her feelings towards Celeste had not been platonic. They had been romantic. She had been interested in Celeste as a partner. But she then quickly clarified and said that was in the past and that now they really were just friends. And so Knight took stock of this and didn't really ask too many follow-up questions on their relationship. And instead, he just said, "Okay, well, where were you the night before?" And Tracy said she had been here at her house the whole time. She said that she had ordered pizza and she'd had a few beers and then had just gone to bed. Knight asked her if she owned a gun, and Tracy said yes, but she only used it for skeet shooting. Knight asked if he could see her gun, and so Tracy got up and she walked over and opened up a closet and she pulled out a shotgun in a zippered case. Knight asked her if he could take her gun down to the ballistics department, and Tracy definitely hesitated for a moment, but then she was like, "Sure." Later that same day, Sergeant Knight walked through the crime scene at the Beard Mansion, looking for any clues that the investigators might have missed during the initial search. Celeste's twin daughters, Christina and Jennifer, had actually come with him to help point out anything that could be out of place that he wouldn't necessarily notice. Inside of Steve's bedroom, Knight saw that some of the drawers and closets had been left open, as if they had been ransacked by a burglar. But something about the whole scene just didn't seem right. The drawers, they didn't appear to have been ripped open as if somebody was in a rush. They had been pulled out really carefully, and inside the drawer, things were basically pretty neat. And so tonight, this didn't really appear to be a burglary. He suspected that someone might have staged the crime scene to appear to be a burglary to throw off the investigation. However, just for good measure, he asked the twin girls to look through all of these open drawers and closets to see if you can identify anything that was missing. And so the girls began looking around, and eventually Christina said that she couldn't find Stephen's watch or his sapphire ring. Now, on the one hand, this might give credit to the idea that this really was a burglary gone wrong, that Steve was just sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time and got shot by the burglar. But tonight, this development that these two small items were gone actually only seemed to confirm the idea that this was not a burglary gone wrong, because this whole house was chock full of nice jewelry and antiques. There's so many other things in the house that could have been taken that were obvious that were not taken. And so Knight, he left the bedroom, walked down the hallway, and went into the living room. And there he's looking around at all this obviously very expensive furniture and vases and paintings and all this stuff that's super valuable all over the place. He began to consider another possibility, that maybe somebody in the family had killed Steve for the inheritance. I mean, this guy clearly is loaded. Now, Knight didn't know what Steve's will said yet, but he knew that along with his 2 stepdaughters, he had 3 adult children from his first marriage, and all of them very likely stood to inherit millions of dollars when he died. And then there was Steve's wife, Celeste, who was less than half his age. It was hard not to wonder if she'd simply married him for his money. And so it wasn't really a far cry to wonder if maybe she had been involved in the shooting, because if he dies, maybe she'd get all of his money. And so as Knight was thinking about this and wandering back down the hallway, he noticed a trap door in the ceiling that led to an attic that he hadn't noticed before. So, curious, he reached up and pulled open the door, and then he climbed up the ladder that came down, and before long he was in the attic. And up in the attic, he saw there was a box lying on the floor just a few feet away, and, where everything else in the attic had been totally covered in dust and cobwebs, this box was not. It was perfectly clean, as if it had only been put up here pretty recently. So he grabbed the box and he opened the lid up, and inside was a 20-gauge shotgun. Knight knew this could be extremely important to this case, so he immediately packaged up the box, picked it up, and he carried it down the ladder back down to the main floor. And when he got down there, he saw one of the twin girls, Jennifer, staring at him looking really nervous. She rushed to explain that shotgun she had purchased as an anniversary gift for her boyfriend, and she was just keeping it up there out of sight until it was time to give it to him. She swore the gun had never been fired, and she had not even taken it out of the box yet. Now, Knight heard what she said, but he held on to the box because he still was going to bring it back to the ballistics department right away to have it tested. I mean, it seemed very odd to him that Jennifer hadn't mentioned until now that there was a gun in the house, and that it just happened to be the exact same gun, same caliber, as the weapon that was used to shoot Steve. Now, Jennifer did have an alibi. She had been at the lake house at that sleepover 30 miles away on the night of Steve's shooting. But her sister, Christina, had been home the whole night, and Knight had to wonder if maybe the 2 sisters had plotted together to kill their stepfather, maybe for his money. After all, it just seemed weirdly convenient that Jennifer, Christina, their boyfriends, their other friend Amy had all, without any hesitation, named Tracy Tarleton as the suspect. It just seemed like something here was not quite adding up. That evening, Detective Knight went back to the hospital, and the nurse at the front desk told him that Steve was out of surgery and was stable enough to finally have visitors. She gave him Steve's room number and then let him through. However, when he got down the hallway to Steve's room, he saw this handwritten sign taped to the door that said, "No law enforcement personnel allowed to interview patient except in the presence of his attorney." And as Knight was processing this pretty surprising sign, out of nowhere, Steve's wife, Celeste, came rushing down the hallway and literally blocked him from going into the room. She said that, for one, she was not going to allow any further searches of her and Steve's house, and if police wanted to speak to her husband, they'd have to go through the family's lawyer. And Knight, he was stunned by this, because in all his years on the force, he had never seen a victim hire a defense attorney. And then more than that, Knight wasn't even sure if Steve was the one who made this decision. Steve was stable now, but he really had no idea if he was actually conscious. Was it Steve who decided to put up this roadblock? Or was it Celeste? So at this point, Knight really didn't know what he was legally allowed to do here. And so, using an abundance of caution, he just turned around and left, at least for now. And as he, walked out of the hospital, he tried to make sense of why Celeste was suddenly being so defensive. Even if she was not the one who made this decision, the way she had just treated him in the hallway was just very aggressive. And then he began to wonder if maybe she had heard about the gun that he had found in their attic and was now trying to just protect her daughters. Or maybe she was trying to protect herself. On the afternoon of October 7th, so 5 days after Steve Beard was shot, Sergeant Paul Knight looked through a folder of interview notes at his desk. By this point, he'd spoken to all 3 of Steve's own children, his adult children. but they were all ruled out as suspects because they all lived hours away and had solid alibis. When Knight had asked one of Steve's sons if he knew who might have done this, he had told the detective to look into Celeste. I mean, after all, pretty much they all thought she was in this marriage for money to begin with. But, Knight had tested Celeste for gunshot residue right after the shooting, so he knew she literally could not have been the one who pulled the trigger. And so at this point, to Knight, it just sort of felt like the entire family was just pointing fingers at each other. But at the same time, Knight did feel like at least one family member on some side of the family was likely involved in the shooting. There was just frankly too much money at stake here. In particular, it was definitely suspicious that Celeste's daughter, Jennifer, had a 20-gauge shotgun in the attic. And on top of that, that she and her twin sister Christina and all of their friends had immediately pointed the finger at Tracy Tarleton. And then as for Tracy, I mean, she did have a pretty weak alibi and she did own a 20-gauge shotgun. But despite that, she had absolutely no history of doing anything violent like this. And she was remarkably cooperative and had even handed over her shotgun for analysis without really any fight at all. And so at this point, Knight knew he really just needed to speak directly to Steve. But the family's attorney was preventing the police from seeing him. And Knight wasn't sure how stable his condition was, or really how much longer he would even be alive for. So this was a very tenuous situation. But just then, Knight noticed something out of the corner of his eye. And he looked up, and he saw there was another detective in the doorway of his office, just sort of leaning there with a big smile on their face. Knight asked them what was going on, and the detective walked over and handed him a manila folder. And he told him this was a forensics report they had just gotten back. A piece of evidence that had been found at the crime scene may have just cracked the entire case. Based on forensic evidence, confessions, and witness interviews, this is what police believe happened to Steve Beard in the early morning hours of October 2nd, 1999. Around 2:30 a.m., the killer turned off their headlights as they drove toward the Beard mansion. They parked at the back entrance to the property, far away from the house, so the noise of their engine wouldn't wake anybody up inside. They got out of the car, slung a shotgun over their shoulder, and began walking through the trees towards the mansion. And as the patio came into view, they stopped. They felt sick, and they actually didn't want to go through with this, but they had made a promise. They had to do it. So they swallowed their fear and continued walking towards the mansion. And when they got right to the steps that would lead up to the patio, they went to the right and they walked to a separate door that led into the living room. That glass door was unlocked, so they opened it up, they stepped inside, and then once inside, they navigated their way to the main bedroom. And when they went inside the main bedroom, they found Steve asleep in his bed. The killer walked to the foot of the bed and just stared at Steve for a second. And then, when they were ready, they raised the shotgun in their shaking hands, and they pulled the trigger. And the blast was deafening. Blood began pouring out of Steve's abdomen immediately. The killer reflexively racked the shotgun, ejecting the shotgun shell, getting ready to fire a second time if need be. But then, Steve, he began fumbling for the nightstand, like he was maybe reaching for a weapon of his own. And the killer, at this point, they're reaching down on the ground, trying to find the spent shotgun shell to take that with them. But they're so scared that Steve's about to shoot them. And so they just abandon the shotgun shell. And then with their shotgun, the killer runs out of the bedroom, down the hallway, back out through the living room, back out the same door they came in, knocking that lamp over in the process. They shut the doors behind them and ran to their car. And from there, they drove to a safe location where they washed their hands, they threw their clothes into the washer, and then they very thoroughly cleaned their shotgun. And then after it was pristine again, they put the shotgun back into storage. The killer was in fact Tracy Tarleton, Celeste's friend from the hospital who all the kids had said she's the one who did this. Well, it was her. The shell that was found on Steve's floor came back from ballistics as an exact match for Tracy's shotgun. And so she was arrested on October 8th, less than a week after the shooting. And then after she was arrested, she confessed to the killing and said that ultimately she had killed Steve because she was in love with Celeste and she wanted Celeste all to herself. However, a few months later, in January of 2000, Steve actually died from his injuries. And after that, a new story began to emerge. It turned out that Tracy's love for Celeste was not one-sided. The two women had been having a full-blown affair for months before the murder. In fact, Celeste had begun secretly slipping Everclear into Steve's cocktails, which is more than twice as strong as the vodka that Steve thought he was drinking. And so basically, Celeste would get Steve really, really drunk and get him to pass out. And then once he would pass out, Celeste would go sneak off and spend the night with Tracy. According to Tracy, Celeste had asked her to kill Steve so they could be together. And so for the first few months after Tracy's arrest, Tracy kept her mouth shut about Celeste's involvement. But then 5 months after Steve died, Celeste got remarried to a man that she had just met. And that's when Tracy realized that Celeste was not really in love with her. She had been using her to get rid of Steve so she could inherit all his money. And so when this happened, Tracy was so hurt by what Celeste had done that she began telling the real truth with the authorities. And eventually, she agreed to testify against Celeste. And so based on Tracy's testimony, Celeste was arrested on March 28, 2002. She was eventually found guilty of Steve's murder and sentenced to life in prison. Tracy was also convicted of murder, but because of her cooperation, her sentence was reduced to just 20 years, and she was actually released on parole in 2011. One hot afternoon in May of 1891, a 31-year-old businessman named James Hatcher rushed through the small town of Pikeville, Kentucky. And as he made his way, he could feel people staring at him because he knew he very likely looked crazy. His hair was totally wild, his suit that he had slept in the night before was all rumpled from sleeping in it, and he was swatting at all the flies that were buzzing around his head. Flies were very common in this part of Kentucky in the spring. But right now, James did not care what anybody thought, because his only focus at this very moment was just getting to the town doctor's office. Because in his hand, he held this legal document that he was sure would put an end to the psychological torture he'd been enduring ever since his wife had died. So up until very recently, James had had sort of a charmed, perfect life. Even though he was a pretty young guy, he was still one of the richest men in town. He'd made his fortune in coal and real estate. And in fact, he actually owned most of Pikeville, where he was. But more than having lots of money and resources, the real thing that had made him so happy and really fulfilled his life was that he'd had this great marriage to his wife, Octavia. And last year, they had gotten pregnant with their first child, and it just seemed like everything was coming up roses. But then 4 months ago, tragedy had struck. Their baby had died just hours after being born, and it was arguably the worst thing that had ever happened to James or his wife. That is until just last week, when Octavia herself had died. The doctor had told James that his wife had died from a broken heart, from losing her child. It had just been so much, it had killed her. And during the chaos of making the arrangements for the funeral and just grappling with this overwhelming grief, not only for the loss of his child still, but now his wife as well. I mean, his life is wrecked here. James had not questioned the cause of death. He had just accepted it. But after the funeral, when James was back inside of his mansion, now all by himself because his family has been wiped out here, he found himself just like unable to live. I mean, he couldn't sleep, he couldn't go to work, he couldn't do anything. All he could do was just pace around the mansion by himself, just obsessing over how in the world this could have happened. How could he have lost his child and his wife, a week apart? How could that have happened? He had a perfect life. How could this be? And the more he obsessed over this unbelievable loss, the more he began to question specifically how his wife had died. Because again, he had been told by the doctor she had died of a broken heart, but he was thinking, wait a minute, I just don't buy that diagnosis. Like there's gotta be something else. Now, of course, it was true that Octavia was completely devastated after losing her baby. I mean, she and her husband both were devastated. But people did not die of sadness, not really. I mean, they can decline rapidly, but to literally die from a broken heart just seemed impossible. And so now the question of what really had killed his wife was all James could think about. It was like instead of just grieving the loss of his wife and his child, it was like he needed to solve what happened to his wife for real. And pretty quickly, James decided that the only real way to figure out what happened to his wife was not going and talking to the doctor again or reading literature, about various symptoms that could have been hers and try to tie it to some disease or something. No, he realized that the best thing he could do is just go dig his wife up and have a look. So James had convinced a local judge to order an emergency exhumation, to dig up his wife. And the judge had said yes, and he had given him a legal document saying he could do that. And so that legal document was what he was carrying as he hustled through town looking totally crazy on his way to the town doctor's office. Because it was ultimately the town doctor who would actually examine his wife's body once the exhumation was complete. And so James, he finally reaches the doctor's office and he bangs on the door, and eventually the doctor opened up, sort of looking at this guy who, again, looks totally wild, frumpled suit, hair crazy, flies everywhere. And he's like, hey, what's going on? And James, he just hands over this legal document, the order that says he's going to exhume his wife. And the doctor took the order and he read it, and he kind of looked up at James with almost like a look of sympathy on his face. Like he felt bad for James. Like obviously this man's life has just fallen to shambles here. Now, the doctor was clearly prepared to fulfill this order and to look at his wife's body, but he made a point of telling James that, digging up Octavia now just was not a good idea. It wouldn't change what happened, and it definitely would not bring her back. Like, this is not the move here. But James knew all this, and he really didn't care about anything the doctor was saying because he wasn't trying to bring his wife back. He just wanted to know the truth. He had to. And so later that afternoon, James and the doctor stood by Octavia's tombstone as a pair of cemetery workers dug up her grave. And it was so hot outside that James and the doctor were sweating profusely, and these flies are everywhere. I mean, it's kind of a miserable scene here. But James, he was just kind of overcome by this sense of almost dread. Like he definitely wanted to do this, but he's realizing that any moment here after these guys dig up this grave, that he's going to physically see his wife again, his dead wife. And he didn't really know how he was going to feel, like literally seeing her in the condition that she was going to be in, decomposed. But he knew this was the right thing to do. So he just sat there, swatting at flies, sweating profusely, just waiting. And eventually, one of the workers with their shovel, they dug into the ground and it struck something hard. It was the coffin. And so at that point, James and the doctor, they kind of leaned into the hole to look down, and one of the workers got to the side and lifted up the lid of the coffin, and inside was Octavia. But Octavia was not in the same position she had been in when she was lowered into the ground. She was sort of in this position with her hands up, and across the top, the inside top of the actual coffin, were all these deep gouges, like scratch marks on the inside of the coffin, and Octavia's nails were all flipped backwards. So shortly after James buried his wife, he's totally heartbroken. He's questioning, the doctor's diagnosis of what actually killed her. And in that period of time, over those few days after the funeral, there were several people in Pikeville that came down with a mysterious illness. They almost appeared to be dead, but it would turn out it was just from being bit by these flies that were swarming around everybody this spring. And so James, as he's thinking about his wife and like what really killed her, he began to have this panicked thought that maybe his wife hadn't died at all. Forget the broken heart thing. Maybe she had just been bit by a fly and appeared to be dead, and now I've buried her. And so he had to get her up, exhume her, and check. And when he opened up the coffin, he saw he was right. She had not died of a broken heart. She clearly had been bit by a fly. She woke up underground in her coffin and slowly asphyxiated while trying to burrow her way back out again. Shortly after James had buried his wife in the ground, like in those subsequent few days, he noticed several people in Pikeville, where he lived, had come down with something they called sleeping sickness, which is something you get from being bit by one of those flies that are always buzzing around these folks' heads in this town in the spring. And, sleeping sickness sometimes can take the form of just having like a fever and being very achy. But in some cases, really bad sleeping sickness can cause people to drift into a coma for several days. Sometimes they wake up, but sometimes they don't. They die. Or others, like the sleeping sickness is so severe that it causes their heart rate to drop so low that they're not in a coma, but they almost like give the impression of being dead. And so sleeping sickness basically mimics death and sometimes causes death, but some people do come out of it. And so James, he's seeing all these people have this illness, and he began to wonder, well, wait a minute, I'm already questioning my wife's diagnosis. What if something even worse happened? What if she wasn't even dead? What if she had just gotten bit by one of those flies and had sleeping sickness? And so in a panic, he has her exhumed, and when he opens the coffin, what does he see? All the signs in the world that his wife had not been dead, so she did not die of a broken heart. No, she was alive when she was buried, and at some point she woke up, but she was trapped, and she slowly asphyxiated while trying to claw her way out. She must have been bit by a fly and got sleeping sickness. One morning in early 2020, a 24-year-old woman named Rosa Sanchez laid in a hospital bed inside of a national medical center in Lima, Peru. And while she lay in her bed, Rosa was sort of vaguely aware of doctors and nurses and a small group of strangers sort of leering over her, staring at her like she was some kind of medical anomaly. But Rosa really couldn't pay attention to anyone right now, because right now, she was feeling sicker than she ever had felt in her whole life. Her stomach hurt so much that it felt like, she was rotting from the inside out or something. And at the same time she was having this awful physical symptom, she was also feeling incredibly depressed and overwhelmed with guilt. So just a few months ago, Rosa had been a happy, successful college student working towards a degree in economics. But then there had been this outbreak, this sudden disease outbreak at her school, and a bunch of students, including Rosa, had gotten sick with some kind of mysterious illness that still had not been identified. And Rosa had gotten so sick, she actually had to temporarily drop out of school and move back home with her mother and father and 2 little siblings. And it was at that time that something truly just tragic and unimaginable happened. Rosa, when she came home, was still sick, and she wound up infecting her entire family, all 4 of them, and within weeks, they all died. Rosa's still alive, but her family is now wiped out from this disease that she still had. And so Rosa now is not only dealing with this horrific illness that feels like it's killing her, but she's living with the reality that, in her mind, she caused the deaths of her whole family. And so this is just like the worst possible scenario anybody could be in. And so now in the hospital, Rosa, who's sort of just totally out of it, she's racked with pain in her stomach. She could tell that a doctor had actually moved up right next to her bedside, and he began telling her some of the results from the recent diagnostic testing they had been running on her. And the doctor told her that, they had run all these blood work tests and they'd done these imaging scans, but so far everything had come back normal. And so they still didn't know what was wrong with her. However, the doctor did say that he wanted to try a different kind of test that might be able to tell them a little bit more. He explained that since Rosa's basic imaging scans had come back normal, what he wanted to do now was try a more advanced type of imaging known as a SPECT scan. Before she could even ask what a SPECT scan was, he explained to her that what it would be is she would be injected with this radioactive substance, and then after that, they would have her lie down inside of this machine that could basically trace the substance as it moved through her body. Basically, this would allow doctors to not just look at Rosa's internal organs, but to actually see how they were functioning in real time. Hearing this, Rosa couldn't help but be a little weary of the idea of a radioactive substance being injected into her body. But at the same time, her life is in shambles. She basically knows this disease is probably going to kill her at some point, and so she was desperate enough to try anything. So she closed her eyes and just nodded yes, she would try this new scan. About an hour later, Rosa was laying on this long, thin platform right outside of the SPECT scan machine, which was like this big machine that was shaped kind of like a donut with an opening large enough for her to be basically slid in through horizontally. By this point, Rosa had already been injected with this radioactive substance. And now the same doctor who had suggested this scan in the first place stood right beside her and told her that the actual scan would only take maybe, 30 minutes once she was inside of this machine. And all she would have to do during the scan was just lie perfectly still. So Rosa said okay, and then she heard the doctor leave the room. A moment later, the SPECT machine began making a whirring sound, at which point the platform that Rosa was laying on began moving, and she was brought inside of this machine, inside of the donut. And then eventually the platform stopped. And at that point, she's just looking at the inside of this machine, which was just, white plastic all around her. And for a couple of minutes, as the scan began, and Rose is just laying there, being as still as possible, everything seemed fine. She had never done a SPECT scan before. But then, out of nowhere, pain ripped through Rose's abdomen, which was already in pain, but this was a new pain. It was so severe. Like, she knew she was supposed to stay still, but she couldn't help but sort of lean forward from how much pain was in her gut. And then as she's telling herself to stay calm, she began feeling lightheaded, and she had tunnel vision, and she began to panic. She's claustrophobic. And then before long, her ears were ringing. And then it was like everything just kind of faded. Her vision went black, and Rosa died. And so the doctor, he's outside of the room, and he's hearing and seeing in real time Rosa basically dying. And so as fast as he can, he shuts off the SPECT machine, which immediately causes the platform that she is on to automatically go back out of the machine. And so as the doctor runs into the room, he sees Rosa just lying there on this platform, outside of the machine, and she's completely limp, like she's lifeless. But the doctor was thinking the scan had actually worked. It told him exactly what was wrong with Rosa. What the scan had shown the doctor before Rosa died was that Rosa had severely low blood flow to several crucial areas of her brain. And this lack of blood flow was what had actually caused all of her symptoms. But this was actually really good news, because now the doctor simply leaned over Rosa, looked into her wide open eyes, and told her to please just go ahead and sit up, because Rosa was not dead. She just thought she was. It would turn out Rosa was suffering from two extremely rare psychological disorders. The first was known as Cotard's syndrome, and it caused Rosa to believe that she was literally rotting from the inside out, and then eventually that she died. She literally believed that she had died inside of the scanner. And the second rare psychological disorder was Capgras syndrome. It had caused Rosa to think that many of the people close to her, like her classmates and her own family members, had gotten sick and died from this mystery illness. And then they had been replaced by clones. The reality here was that there actually was never any disease outbreak at Rosa's school or in her home. The group of strangers in Rosa's hospital room were her mother, father, and two siblings. They were perfectly fine. As for Rosa herself, she was obviously mentally very unwell, but physically, she was never sick at all. Now, Rosa would need continued psychiatric care, but after 3 weeks in the hospital, she was able to go home with the family that she believed she had lost forever. In the spring of 1988, a 27-year-old woman named Severina stood in the corner of a small adobe house in the rural village where she lived in the mountains of Bolivia. The house belonged to a curandero, which was a traditional healer. Severina had come here with her two aunts because her aunts were sick and in desperate need of help from the curandero. So 2 weeks earlier, Severina's aunts had come down with these horrible fevers, and they had been in bed for days, and they had both been so tired and so weak that they could barely move or even eat. However, despite eating, both of their stomachs had swollen up like balloons, and then the skin on the outside of their stomachs had actually turned black, almost like the skin itself was dying. And it was at that point that Severina decided that her aunts could no longer afford to just hope this goes away on its own. They needed to go see a professional, go see the local healer. And so now Severina watched as her two aunts were told by the curandero to lie down on these mats in the middle of the floor. And both aunts they're very weak and sick, but they lie down. And the curandero, as they're lying down, lit incense and began waving it over their bodies. And then he inspected their faces and also their black stomachs. Then, a moment later, he turned his attention to this folded up blanket that was sitting near the aunts' heads. He took the blanket and he unfurled it and sort of laid it out in front of him, and then wrapped up inside of this blanket was a small pile of coca leaves. And the curandero, he picked out a few of these leaves and just sort of appeared to scatter them on the blanket. And then he appeared to study the leaves, like he was looking for signs that the leaves were going to give him. And Severina knew that these leaves were telling him what was wrong with her aunts. Finally, the curandero, after looking at these leaves for a bit, he looked up at Severina and told her that her aunts were sick with a blood curse, which meant that the blood flowing through their veins was literally cursed with dark magic. But that wasn't all. The curandero went on, telling Severina that this was actually not just a blood curse, but it was a family blood curse, which meant that someday she, Severina, would also get this curse and very likely die. When Severina heard this, a chill ran through her body, and she almost instinctively began scratching at her arms, like she could scratch this curse, out of her skin or something. But the curandero looked at her and just said, "There's nothing you can do. There's no cure for you or your aunts. Your fate, and theirs, is sealed." A few days later, Severina was back in her own home, in her own kitchen, making some herbal tea for her aunts, who were staying in her guest bedroom. And as she prepared this tea, all she could hear was the sound of her aunts moaning in pain and agony in the other room. So Severina, as quickly as she could, she finished making the tea and then hustled into the guest bedroom. So over the past few days, after leaving the curandero's hut, Severina's aunts had gotten sicker and sicker and sicker. They now couldn't eat anything, and they were constantly so dizzy they could barely even lift their heads up off their pillow. And they both just seemed so weak and so depleted, and their stomachs were still black and bloated, and they had these agonizing stomach cramps basically all the time. It was obvious that they were dying. And their sickness had just been horrifying for Severina to watch on many levels. And so at this point, all Severina was really trying to accomplish was just doing her best to try to make her aunts as comfortable as possible until they died. And so now Severina walked over and she sort of assisted one of the aunts and had them sit up, and she tried to give her some of this tea that she had made. But when her aunt just smelled the herbal tea, she began to dry heave, and Severina jumped out of the way just as her aunt threw up bile all over her own lap. Immediately, the smell of this vomit and the smell of death and just the smell of filth that was filling this room, it just went right up Severina's nostrils, and she had to immediately run from the room and go outside where she vomited just from being so grossed out by being in that room. Severina felt completely overwhelmed by what was happening here. I mean, she obviously was just devastated to see her aunts in this condition. But what was even worse is it was like she was sort of watching what was going to happen to her, and she just couldn't believe it. And so she thought to herself, any day now, I'm going to begin showing symptoms that shows I too have this blood curse, and I'm going to begin withering away and then rotting until I die. And as she had this thought, she found herself again scratching at her arms as if somehow she could rip this illness out of her body before it took her life. Later that same night, after Severina had composed herself and gone back into the house, she had seen that her aunts did need more tea. And so she had left to go get more herbal tea remedies from the curandero. But after getting it and coming back to her house, she found that both of her aunts by this point had died. And the moment she saw them, Severina was overcome with both grief and also fear. Over the next few weeks, as she buried her aunts and grieved for them alongside her family, what she really was thinking about is, when is this blood curse gonna kill me too? And as months turned into years and still she didn't get sick, Severina began to wonder if maybe the curandero had been wrong. Maybe she didn't have this blood curse. Maybe it wasn't a family curse. But then, 30 years later, in the fall of 2018, when Severina was 57 years old, she woke up one morning with a stomach cramp, and she also felt very nauseous and a little dizzy. And even though by this point it's been 30 years since her aunts died of this illness, she knew immediately on that morning that the curse had finally arrived and it was now going to kill her. So she forced herself to get out of bed, and then she walked outside to where her husband and her daughter were sitting and having coffee. And she told them what was going on here. And when she told her family that she has this blood curse and there's nothing they can do, her daughter, whose name was Janet, said, "Wait a minute, Mom, go to a doctor." But Severina argued that there was no point because the curandero 30 years ago had told her that nothing would help, and she had watched her aunts die from this very thing. Like there was nothing she could do. She was doomed. But Janet begged her mother to just forget what you were told 30 years ago. Forget all that and just go see a doctor. Even if they can't do anything, just go. And eventually, Severina relented and said, "Fine, I'll go to the doctor even though it's not going to help. So later that day, they made the long journey into the nearest city to go see a doctor. At the doctor's office, a doctor took blood samples and ran tests on Severina and listened carefully as she explained the family blood curse. And as Severina and her family waited for the test results to come back, she braced herself because she knew that the doctor would say that, sorry, yep, the tests show there's nothing we can do here. And finally, the doctor did come back into the room and he told Severina that she was right. The curandero had been right. This was blood related. There was something in her blood. And immediately Severina just kind of collapsed in her chair because she knew what came next was an agonizing death, the same way her aunts had died. But then the doctor told her what this blood curse actually was. And at first, Severina was just really confused by what the doctor was saying. But then, as she's hearing this new information, she remembered all the times when she was younger, when she would reflexively itch her skin when she thought about the blood curse, like she would itch to scratch it out of her body. It was almost like this reflexive thing that she was doing, not realizing that every time she scratched her arms, she was quite literally giving herself the curse. It would turn out the so-called blood curse that Severina's aunts had was actually caused by a parasite. And it was true, Severina also had this blood curse. She too had a parasite in her body that would do the same thing. But Severina's parasite, it went dormant inside of her body for more than 30 years. So no symptoms, nothing for 30 years, just living inside of her skin. In many parts of South America, there is a bug called the vinchuca, which is essentially a type of bed bug. The bug itself is harmless, but there's a parasite that lives in the bug's feces. When the bug bites its victims, and its victims scratch at the bites, they break the surface of their skin and infect themselves with this parasite. Then the parasite can lay dormant in the person's blood, sometimes for decades. Now, a lot of people don't even realize they have this because they never have symptoms ever. But if symptoms do appear without any real treatment, the person suffers organ damage or even dies. Luckily, in Severina's case, when her parasite became active again 30 years later, she was able to receive treatment for the parasite and would make a full recovery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.